Imagine standing between two neighbors who are at war and depending on both of them for your own economy and security. That is the position Turkey has occupied since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Turkey is a NATO member. It has supplied Ukraine with weapons. It supports Ukraine's territorial integrity. And at the same time, it has not joined Western sanctions against Russia. It maintains billions of dollars in trade with Moscow, and it extended its Russian gas contracts as recently as December 2025. How can a country do all of those things simultaneously? Tonight, on Words with Wentz, we are going to answer that question by explaining three things most news coverage of this war either skips over or buries in jargon. First, a 1936 international treaty that gives Turkey control of one of the most strategically important waterways in the world, and how Turkey has used it in this war. Second, what Turkey's balancing act actually looks like in practice: drones, diplomacy, and the grain corridor that briefly helped stabilize global food prices. Third, the current state of U.S. military support for Ukraine under the Trump administration, which is significantly more complicated than most headlines suggest. Understanding these three things will give you a more complete picture of this conflict than most people have. Let's start with the treaty. The Montreux Convention was signed in 1936, before the Second World War, before NATO, before the Soviet Union became a superpower. It is a treaty between Turkey and several other nations that gives Turkey the authority to regulate naval access to the Black Sea through two narrow straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, which run directly through Turkish territory. Under the convention, Turkey has the right to restrict the passage of warships during wartime. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Ukraine formally requested that Turkey invoke this authority. Turkey did. The result was significant in two directions simultaneously. Russia could not reinforce its Black Sea fleet with warships from the Mediterranean. That fleet, which had been a major instrument of Russian military power, became isolated in the Black Sea and vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. Ukrainian drone and missile strikes have since destroyed or damaged a substantial portion of it. But the same ruling also meant that NATO warships from countries without Black Sea coastlines could not enter to support Ukraine. Turkey's application of an 88-year-old treaty simultaneously limited Russia's naval power and limited NATO's ability to project force in support of Ukraine. That is not a contradiction. It is geography as strategy. Turkey controls the only gateway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The 1936 treaty makes that control legal and binding under international law, and how Turkey uses that authority shapes the war. Turkey's approach to this war has been described as a balancing act, and it is worth understanding what that actually means in practice. On the Ukraine side, Turkey supplied Bayraktar TB2 armed drones to Ukraine before and during the war. These drones proved significant in the early stages of the conflict, helping Ukraine defend against Russian armor and supply lines. Turkey also supports Ukraine's territorial integrity, including its claim to Crimea. On the diplomatic side, Turkey hosted negotiations, facilitated prisoner exchanges, and, working with the United Nations, established the Black Sea Grain Initiative in 2022. That agreement created a corridor allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported from Black Sea ports, temporarily stabilizing global food prices that had spiked dramatically after the invasion. The initiative expired in July 2023 after Russia withdrew. On the Russia side, Turkey has not joined Western sanctions on Russia. Turkish exports to Russia more than doubled following the invasion. Turkey supplying machinery, electronics, and other goods that Russia could no longer obtain from Europe. In December 2025, Turkey extended its Russian gas supply contracts for another year. Turkish companies have faced accusations from U.S. officials of facilitating sanctions evasion. These are not contradictions in Turkish foreign policy. They reflect a deliberate strategy. Turkey maintains leverage over both sides, positions itself as an indispensable mediator, and protects its own economic interests, all simultaneously. As of mid-2026, Turkey is now taking a more prominent role, leading the maritime dimension of the Coalition of the Willing for Ukraine, a 33-nation grouping preparing security arrangements for a potential post-war settlement. That represents a significant shift from the strict balance Turkey maintained for the first 3 years of the war. The question of American military support for Ukraine is more complicated than most headlines suggest, and it is worth understanding the actual numbers. Under the Biden administration, the United States committed more than $67 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Most of that military aid was appropriated by Congress and contracted for delivery, but a substantial portion had not yet been physically delivered when the Trump administration took office in January 2025. According to analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, approximately $29 billion in contracted military equipment was still in the pipeline, meaning under contract but not yet manufactured or delivered. Those deliveries are continuing and will continue until approximately 2028, regardless of new policy decisions. Since January 2025, the Trump administration has made no new major authorizations of direct military assistance to Ukraine. On two occasions, in early July 2025 and again briefly, the administration temporarily paused deliveries of some items, including Patriot air defense missiles and ammunition. Both pauses were reversed within days, and the Pentagon confirmed deliveries resumed at President Trump's direction. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2026, signed by President Trump in December 2025, allocates $400 million for Ukraine through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. To put that in context, the April 2024 supplemental aid bill under the Biden administration included nearly $14 billion in the same program. The administration's stated approach is that European allies should shoulder more responsibility. In a notable development at the June 2026 NATO summit in The Hague, the United States reached an agreement with NATO allies where weapons from U.S. stocks would be paid for by NATO countries, a mechanism known as the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. Under this arrangement, up to $1 billion in air defense systems were approved for shipment to Ukraine, with NATO allies bearing the cost. The question of how much the United States should support Ukraine is one of the genuine policy debates in American politics, and both sides of that debate make documented arguments. Supporters of continued U.S. military assistance argue that Ukraine has the right of self-defense under international law, and that allowing Russia to succeed in acquiring territory by force would send a dangerous signal to other potential aggressors around the world. They argue that deterrence requires demonstrated commitment. NATO allies, with near-unanimous agreement, have continued to describe the defense of Ukraine as inseparable from Euro-Atlantic security. Critics of continued aid, including voices within the Trump administration, argue that the war in Ukraine diverts limited American military resources from what they see as the primary strategic competition with China. Under-Secretary of Defense Elbridge Colby, who was the primary driver of the July 2025 aid pause, has publicly argued that resources needed to deter Chinese military expansion should not be consumed by the European theater. Others argue that continued military assistance can prolong the conflict and delay a negotiated settlement. What has emerged in practice is a middle position. Significant amounts of already contracted aid continue to flow to Ukraine. No major new appropriations have been authorized, and European allies, particularly the United Kingdom and Germany, who now lead the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, have significantly increased their own contributions. As of July 2026, Russia has made incremental territorial gains in 2024 and 2025 in eastern Ukraine, but its progress has stalled. Peace negotiations continue, with Turkey again serving as a key venue. You might be asking, why does this matter to me? It matters because this conflict involves American tax dollars, American military stockpiles, and American alliance commitments under NATO, a treaty the United States Senate ratified and that legally binds the United States to the collective defense of 31 other nations. It matters because the decisions being made right now about how much to support Ukraine, how much to demand from European allies, and how to handle a country like Turkey that simultaneously supports both sides, will shape the architecture of international security for decades. And it matters because the story is genuinely more complicated than most coverage suggests. A 1936 treaty drafted before the Second World War is shaping a 21st century conflict. A NATO member is selling weapons to one side while trading with the other. and administration is continuing to deliver billions in previously contracted military aid while authorizing no new major commitments. Understanding these layers does not require you to take a position on the war. It requires only that you engage with what is actually happening, with documents, with numbers, and with the context that turns headlines into comprehension. That is what Words with Wentz is for. The documents are in the description and verified at the time of this posting. This is Words with Wentz. Know your rights.